So welcome everyone to the performance and capacity stream. For this session, we have Martin Packer from IBM, who's going to be presenting on open source performance tools. This is session 6AB, so please remember that when you leave your session feedback form. We really welcome that because it helps us improve every year. And if you want to take part in this year's raffle, we ask that you donate to our nominated charity of the year, which is Guide Dogs and RNLI. I will paste the links for that in the chat box. In terms of question and answers, if you would like to ask any questions to Martin, please feel free to put them in the chat box. Or if you want to speak instead, I can just let me know in the chat box and I can get you to come up on stage and you can unmute yourself.
I'm sure you didn't mean speak instead of me. If anybody feels like doing that, be my guest. Yeah, that's fine, folks.
Yeah. So without further ado, over to you, Martin.
Okay, thank you, Piara. Hello, everybody. Shame we're not lifting beers together, isn't it? Really. Okay, so I've been on a bit of a journey, and I've been busy in lockdown. Because I've got a couple of tools that I've managed to get through the IBM process to open source. Now, this was not actually a terribly tedious process. I guess other companies have much more difficulty with it than we do, because we're very much, the only advert IBM will get out of me in this context is we're very much open source positive. Also, if you have a manager who doesn't quite understand what the tools do, then it's not too bad. That's a joke, by the way. So there's a couple of tools that we use in our consulting practice, which I rather think could be useful for other people. And the only way to get them into other people's hands, frankly, is to open source them, because we're never going to make products out of these. And actually, that is what I said to my management, is we're never going to make products out of these, but people would find them useful. So how do we do it? Open source is obviously the answer. So I'm going to take you through both of the ones that I've currently open sourced that are of interest to mainframe people, or at least performance people. I've got other open source tools. I don't intend to bore you with those. Okay, and the first one, DB2 DDF Analysis tool. Well, I'm going to show you some slides that some of you will have seen before. Some of you may even recognize the data in at least one slide's case. And I'm really showing you those slides again, only to get your interest and to show you what you can actually do with the DDF analysis tool. The second one, in workshops, if I've had your data, you will have seen me use the output probably of this tool, the WLM Service Definition formatter. The first one uses SMF, DB2 Accounting Trace, SMF 101. And the purpose is to enable you to do good work in managing your DDF applications and their impact on the system and WLM and so on. The second one basically takes static data, the WLM XML file you can easily generate, and turns it into HTML. And you might go, big deal. Well, the idea is to be able to do some relatively helpful things with it, not just turn XML into HTML, which is not much of a trick, quite frankly. So these are the two tools I want to talk about. Hopefully they will take your interest. Worst case, if I ever see your data, you'll know what on earth I was processing it with. Best case, you might like to be involved in the active development of these or somewhere in between. So I'm going to talk about each tool in turn, and then I'm going to wrap up with a slightly extended conclusion. And as Piara said, look, questions, comments, whatever, at any stage, if I spot them, I can see the chat bottom right, just about, so I ought to notice if somebody does. Okay, so on the left in this card, I'm talking about the DDF analysis tool, and on the right, I'm talking about, obviously, the WLM Service Definition format. Gosh, aren't those awful names? It'd be nice to have better names, but there we go. So the DDF analysis tool processes DB2 Accounting Trace to yield DDF-specific insights. And they are things like, what are the big DDF CPU users? What are the inhibitors to zip eligibility. And I'll show you an example of that one actually in a minute. Identifying what clients, meaning a middle tier or anything else that connects to DB2 via DDF. You can do a lot of time of day analysis as well, which is kind of handy. And Stephen, I know you're out there. Hiatuses and slushing. Just as well he's muting, he's probably sticking his head off at this point. Okay, both of these, to cut long story short, are MIT open source license, which is the best license I can find for people to do what they need to do with it. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. The DDF analysis tool is thoroughly extensible because basically you end up with a database which you can query with DFSort or ICE tool or anything else you like, actually. The records have the fields in fixed positions in them, and we've got some nice DFSort symbols to make it easy to do queries if you're into DFSort as a so-called easy way of querying things, but you could use anything else. And I would expect, and I haven't written any code that I can share, that you would probably be post-processing the result of any queries with either Python or Excel or anything else you please. The WLM Service Definition formatter, basically, as I say, takes the WLM Service Definition, which is something you will export out of WLM, either out of 0SMF or the ISPF WLM application, and works on it and turns it into HTML, adds a lot of things like cross-linking between elements, and I've got an example of that coming up. And it really is the basis for when I look at certain parts of the WLM service definition. So things that RMF won't tell me. Things like classification rules would be a very obvious example of that. It might get you cleaning up stuff. You know, if you're the sort of person who doesn't really like to see typos and spelling errors in things like descriptions, it might well get you to the point of going, to hell with this, I'm going to fix those. Again, MIT open source license. So a little bit about open source. These open source tools are free to use with my intent here really is to provide value. It's nothing else. It's to provide a value that you can gain. And well, there is something else, which is if we can apply some thinking to how these tools work and what they do, then maybe we can actually evolve the state of the art, which sounds like a lofty phrase, but that's really, this is the basis for doing that if we can. The MIT license, as I think you'll see in a moment, enables you to do just about anything you would want to do with these tools within reason. Because it's open source, you can see every single line of code if you want to. You can also see, because we're using GitHub, public GitHub, you know, how the code evolved, well, from the point where I open sourced it in the first place. Obviously, you can't see the 10 or 15 years before that, but that's probably not totally material. You can actually fork your own private copy that you might modify for your own use. For example, you might not like the CSS that I'm using to style the WLM HTML. You can equally contribute to the project, assuming you're committed to by whatever employment contract you have. The governance is transparent here. And there are known committers, basically me at this point, but I don't see why it should remain being me. And if I ever left IBM, by the way, I would probably make the new me be another committer. So I could keep working on it if I want to. You can actually use a mechanism called issues in GitHub to request enhancements or to report bugs. And actually there is a discussion mechanism within GitHub. So the idea here is to be open and transparent, and enable people to participate if they're allowed to by their employers, and if they want to, and if they think that there are things that need changing. And we'll touch on that later, I think. Okay, so I'm going to pause a little bit here to give you a very quick chance to scan this, but basically the first paragraph after the copyright says you can do pretty much anything you would want to do with either code project. But there are some things down the bottom which says don't expect to be able to sue me if you don't like the way it works. So I'll just pause for a second to give you a chance to read through this. I've no idea how fast any of you read. And if you have the handouts, so-called, then you've got a chance to peruse this seriously, maybe wave it under a lawyer's nose or something if you need to do that. Okay, so let's talk in a bit more detail about each of the two tools. So if I start with the DDF tool for short, just to reprise very briefly the about these tools slide, the left-hand card, yeah, there's a bunch of use cases here, and I'm going to take you through bits and pieces of these with some examples which some of you will have seen before. I do all these things listed with my version of the code, and the database is basically a complete copy of what I use internally. And in fact, I tend to push changes out to this project if I enhance something internally or fix something. Not all of the things that I've listed there are done in the queries that are shipped right now. The intention, though, is to deliver on all of those items over time. Quite a lot of this now is actually there as sample queries. And as you basically build a flat file database to do queries against, you can do any queries you like. The examples I've got are actually using DFSOR or even IceTool. Actually, I don't think IceTool as such comes into play just yet in examples. But obviously, that's not the only way of processing a flat file database. All the above things can be achieved actually fairly readily with your own queries or else the ones I've shipped. So the intention here, just to summarize, is to build a database and then report against it in ways that you can customize. I will say the intention here is not actually to replace tools like Excel or one of my mind mapping tools, iThoughts. Though you might well be writing queries or using some built-in queries to directly input into either Excel or iThoughts. So for example, if you want to make graphs, you probably are going to take the CSV files that some of the sample queries make and pull them into Excel, and then good luck with what happens next, because I hate Excel with a passion. But that's probably how you might make graphs, although you could use some other tooling to do that. So let's come back to some things that some of you would have seen before. So the first thing is you can show very readily a nice regular commit pattern like this one. I think that is an architecturally interesting pattern. I will say, and I maybe glossed over this before, this is actually 2 different days or chunks of 2 different days, and you can see the breakpoint between one day and the next right in the middle here. But even seeing a pattern like that is getting beyond just the 15-minute average you would get out of RMF. So I think that's quite a good start. And here I'm thinking we're at the 1-minute level, looking at the scale down the bottom. So one of the key things to take away is you can go below the RMF 15-minute interval level. You can go actually to 100th of a second, though even I'm not insane enough to do that. Okay. So that nice regular pattern thing is good. You can very readily see which DDF work is consuming the CPU. And here, you get used to seeing DB2 JCC apply, which is the correlation ID for JDBC. So you can see it's JDBC app that's driving CPU. It's a slightly weird pattern here, and again, it's across two days, and it looks better in the second day than the first. But drilling down below the subsystem level, let's say at the 1-minute level, is something you can readily do. You can do response time analysis, and actually there's a sample query which I added called bucket, which we'll talk about in a minute, which enables you to do either of these. I mean, this is what you do with Excel. So this is literally commits within the 1 minute interval with different response time values bucketed. This is adding up to 100%. Either is valuable. It's easy to flip in Excel between one and the other. So that's something you can do as well. Now, this is a bit more exotic. There's quite a lot of Rex code I've used to process a DF sort query to be able to make CSV data in a format to feed into iThoughts. So I'm not saying at this point you can do this straight away, and maybe iThoughts isn't the right way of doing it anyway. Maybe some force-directed graphing tooling would be good. I'm open to ideas and contributions on that one. But you have the data for this. You could definitely see, for example, this stuff all looks like DB2 version 10 on ZOS coming in through, obviously I fiddled with the IP addresses here, right? No pretense to have done anything other than that. And obviously this isn't valid hex here, so whatever, or valid decimal even. So you can do this. You might end up depicting your client machines and user IDs and and correlation IDs and what have you a slightly different way. That's fine, but note at very least you can tell the difference between DB2 ZOS clients, and this is AIX 64-bit, and this is probably running on IIS. And here's some Solaris, right? So you can see the clients coming in, which I think is kind of important to be able to do. You just don't have a query right now that enables you to create it in this format. Okay, here's another nice one. So, and this is from a real customer. Actually, everything's from a real customer or other, but different ones. With this one, because we can process IFKID 239, which is package level accounting, into a flat file, you can understand which package, which DB2 package actually has got zip eligibility and which hasn't. So just to spell it out a little bit, if you see orange here, that is actually zip eligible CPU, actually zip running on a zip. So here's a nice one where we've got 60%, roughly speaking, zip eligible and 40% not. That is native stored procedure. Take another stored procedure though, like this one, and we've got no zip eligibility. Right? So the point here is we've got built in the flat file that enables you to work out which packages are non-native and getting invoked and stopping you from getting zip eligibility. You could do this very readily. Haven't got a sample query for this. Maybe that's something I should do fairly early on. Believe me, I've got lots of things I want to do in development terms with lots of projects. So I don't know if that's a priority or not. And as I say, you open an issue and that probably gets my attention in the way that makes it a priority. Okay, now this is one that one of you knows is your own data. And to repeat a point I made earlier, because the SMF timestamp has got 100th of a second granularity, you can go all the way down to 100th of a second in your reporting. Now, in this case, I'm only doing it at the 1 second level, but that's quite enough. You can see what I call a hiatus here, where suddenly you're getting no commits. And then suddenly the floodgates open again and you get an awful lot of commits. One of the key questions, by the way, is it that work doesn't arrive, or is it that work arrives but doesn't finish? Now, we have in the database the fields to enable you to understand that. But this is at the 1 second level, really quite good enough. Also notice the different colors here are different DB2 subsystems in the sysplex sharing the workload. You might not just have hiatuses here, a hiatus here. You might actually have sloshing, and you might have a pre-hiatus happening here. It's interesting stuff, fascinating to me. And you can do it very readily because that's the data's in the database in the format you can go after. Okay, so having warmed you up, I hope, to the idea that this is a useful tool, let's talk about installation. So basically, what we have is a DF sort E15 assembler exit, which you will need to get into a load library. You have JCL, and you need to create some output data sets for reports. You would need, in installation terms, to do some JCL tailoring, but it shouldn't be onerous. So, for example, pointing at this load library and high-level qualifiers and output data set names and stuff like that. So what you do is you download the repo from GitHub as a zip file, and there's a link here which I'm sure is live. If I'm hovering over it and it appears to be live, or you can find it anyway, I'm sure. When you download it, you need to unzip it and upload it to ZOS, well, where you're going to run the analysis jobs. You'll need to assemble the E15 exit with the DB2 supplied standard macro library. I mean, this is a standard library. If you've got a DB2 installation, or you can get hold of it from, move it to the system where you're doing an analysis if there isn't DB2 on there, you can assemble and link edit this very, very readily. We need this E15 exit actually to flatten the records in the database build. Now, if you don't have DF sort and you have a competitive sort product, I don't see why any of the things I'm doing wouldn't work. I don't think that should be an inhibitor. If you find something that breaks with it, then I think you might want to open an issue and we can talk about it. But the intent here is not to use any DF sort specifics, not that there really are many of those anymore, but to be useful. So it's not difficult to actually install. Tiny bit of fiddling, but not much really. Now, in actual practice, once you've got the load library set up, you've got the JCL set up, you need to get input data and you need to manage the database files. The latter, I think, is more difficult actually than the former. So the input data is SMF 101 accounting trace from DB2. You would need at least trace classes 1, 2, and 3. That's plan level. You can actually go deeper, as I showed with the example of why am I not getting 60% when I've got the zip enablement, when I've got stored procedures. I mean, to do that, you really want the package level accounting, which is trace classes 7, 8, and 10. I'll point out the tool is actually really only for DDF. So records for other connection types will be ignored on database build. I should qualify this. DDF clients and servers. So if you've got a batch job that does DDF to another DRDA compliance system, and well, you might, then we will see the QLAC and QMDA sections, and that will enable us not to throw the record away. So it's only DDF whether you're a client or a server. Obviously, you need to get the data to where the tooling is, but none of that should be terribly difficult. And maybe you want to do it for a restricted period of time, let's say an hour or two, if you're just trying to get a sample, or round a problem time frame if you're trying to look at the hiatus or sloshing thing or something else. Data management is a good question, and I consider it an unresolved question. When I get data, it's generally a single block of it from a single time frame, and I'm hatching a new set of JCL through ISPF file tailoring, and it's not an issue to manage the data for me. Your use case might be different, particularly if you were attempting to do this day in, day out, or compare two sets of data. So for me, it's simple. For you, it's more difficult. I mean, you definitely can concatenate the output from the different runs of database builds, the various flat files. I've not tried any method of doing that, in fact. I'm more likely to concatenate the input from different scenarios, because if somebody sends me 2 files from 2 DB2s, I may well want them in the same database. So data management is a good question. It's not an impossible question. It's just not one I can give general guidance on. Okay. So in practice, in using it, you build the database files, running the build DB job, having assembled the E15 exit for it to work with. Then you run the reporting jobs. And I would say, once you get familiar with the data model, you might well tailor them. For example, you might filter on the correlation ID, this case, the JDBC one. The next slide, I'll go through a little bit more detail on the reporting jobs and how you might tailor them. And you probably want to write some post-processing code as well, or just get them into Excel or something like that to do the graphing or whatever it might be. So very simple. Use the raw data, SMF data, to build the database files, run reporting jobs as you see fit, maybe write some custom ones, and post-process the reporting to get it in the format you actually want to use it in, like graphs, for example. Okay, so there aren't many currently included reporting jobs, and the intention is to build on these, but I think these are useful ones, which is why I've put them in early. So the first one's called buckets, and you've seen it, actually the output of it before. So bucket the class 1 response time and TCB time by minute and hour. The idea being to understand the distribution between short commit scope and long commit scope, or light and heavy in the CPU case. You have to tell it what SMF ID, what subsystem ID, and what correlation ID you're focusing on in particular. That's the necessary tailoring. You could do all sorts of things in terms of filtering. So you could filter on a time range. You could adjust the buckets that we're reporting or counting in. That would require a reasonably sophisticated understanding of DF sort, actually, and particularly the if-then operator. Adding buckets, I won't say it's difficult, it's more fiddly. Adjusting the boundaries of the buckets is quite straightforward, actually. The next one is a bit simpler. So basically it's statistics by the minute for a subsystem. And obviously you need a point at the subsystem. That's the necessary tailoring. You could do things like filtering on this thing, Quack WLME, is the WLM service class for the work. So you could filter on, I don't know, DDF hot or something. You could equally filter on the correlation ID. Again, you know, well, it might be xl.exe, for example. Unlikely it would be that one, but that one does show up in data I've seen. Similarly, you can do work by service class, which actually is using Quack WLME. Here, you don't have to tailor beyond obviously pointing at the right data sets, but you could do things like restrict to a sysplex, using SMF ID in a DF sort include statement, for example. You can do lots of things to filter this one. You can drill down into a subsystem at the correlation ID level. This is again time driven. You don't need to do any real tailoring on this, but you could restrict to a DB2 subsystem or even below that. SSID min is minute by minute statistics at the subsystem level for up to 8 subsystems as currently shipped. You would need to nominate, and it's very easy to do this, the SMF ID and the subsystem ID for each of those. You can leave them blank and then you end up with some blank columns in the CSV file that's produced. If you really wanted to, you could cut the number of subsystems down or indeed increase them. That's a little fiddly, but it can easily be done. So these are the currently included reporting jobs. You'll notice the who are the clients one isn't there because, as I say, I haven't really written it in the way, you know, contributed yet in the way that's useful to the project. But I think I probably will fairly soon. I don't even have prototype code, to be honest, with that one, which doesn't involve using the Rex that we use. So that might take a little while. So a bunch of reporting jobs here. So that's DDF analysis tool for sure. There's lots of good things I think you can do with it. Lots of, I mean, I know, and some of you have been my victims in this, that there are lots of interesting conversations can be had from the data as thrown through this tool with a little bit of patience and a little bit of tailoring. So we're half an hour in. I'm not sure I need to speed up, but anyway. Oh, by the way, these are navigation arrows back to previous sections and then to the table of contents. If you're wondering what on earth they are live, hopefully in the PDF. Okay, so the WLM Service Definition tool, as I say, it's taking the XML and it's converting it into HTML in a way that I hope is useful. I personally find very useful. And this XML comes out of a number of places. I think WLM Lab had a Java tool which would emit it. In fact, I think it used it more than emitted it. ZeroSMF, you can get it very easily out of ZeroSMF WLM application, and you can get it out of the ISPF WLM application. It's the same XML in all cases. I've added in lots of cross-linking between the various elements. As I say, you might use it to review your WLM policy, the more cobwebbed corners of it, perhaps. It could provoke a cleanup. It could very well provoke a cleanup. Okay, so some very basic items, and I'm afraid these are a little bit small, but I was trying to get them all on one page using a tool that doesn't really help very much with this. So some basic statistics like what level is the policy, some numbers like how many workloads, how many service classes, how many service class periods, how many report classes are using application environments and resources, and so on. This is a nice one I added recently, which is performance groups, because I think people are using, people were using performance groups transitionally on the way into goal mode way back when. And maybe you want this mechanism now, maybe you don't, but at least we're listing that these aren't counts, these are names of performance or numbers, performance group numbers, PGNs. So there's obviously a set of 6 here. Maybe there's a pattern to them, maybe there isn't. But when I look at this, I go, why are you using these? Is there a better way? So that's kind of an optional cleanup thing. Here, this is where I have a lot of fun actually in presenting, because people go, oh, S6840, that's me, or that's him or her over there. As much to the point here is, what I've done is I've listed the modification dates that appear in the XML, actually equally the creation dates for the elements of the policy. Now, this is not 100% because some modifications don't actually get a date field, modification date field, element filled in. But you get a flavor that in 2004, this customer in this Sysplex probably went to goal mode because there's no timestamps before then. And then they didn't do a huge amount over the years. And suddenly in 2018, they did some stuff. And more recently, they've done a little bit of stuff, right? Now, I've color-coded the various user IDs. The interesting one here is this S6840, where the user ID obviously went to whatever it is, 6-digit, 7-digit, it doesn't really matter. 6-digit, it's obviously the same person. This is probably tourist information, the user IDs, but it gives some flavor. There's somebody who from 2008 at least onwards was heavily involved in looking after the WLM policy. That's tourist information for me more than you, but at least you get a flavor of, particularly if you're taking on a site, whether this is an actively maintained policy and when the major changes happen. You can actually see in the more detailed tables in the HTML what the changes were, although I haven't made it easy yet to navigate from, let's say, 2018 to all the 2018 changes. I think that would be quite cumbersome, to be honest. Service parameters, obviously, are a fairly basic thing here. So that's basic information. Now, it gets a bit more interesting when you get into the details. So here's a good basic example of hyperlinks in the tool. So we've got scheduling environments, and the scheduling environments in the XML show the resources involved and their required state. Now here, let's take one, Editran. This, I think, by the way, is Portuguese, if I remember who it is. But it looks awfully like Spanish as well, doesn't it? But anyway, the point is this resource here, however they pronounce it, there's a listing in the resource table. And if you would, these aren't side by side in the HTML. If you were to click on this in your browser, it would take you to what that resource actually was. I'm looking at this, and this is a Spanish customer, actually in Spain. I now remember who it is, exactly who it is. So the point is hyperlinks take you from one thing to another thing very readily. Okay. Talking of following links, here's another possibly more useful example. So you can go from classification group, there's a table for classification group to classification rules. So here we have a group called GSTC 088, whatever that is, well, it's clear what it is. And here are the transaction names, which are going to be address space names. By the way, I'm doubting these are in fact AF operator. I'm doubting that very, very much, but I don't really know. I think they're Amigamon, to be honest, or bits of Amigamon, maybe not, I don't know. But anyway, there's a classification group, and it's used in the classification rule, transaction name group classification rule, and here it is, right? So you can go from where it's defined to where it's used. Actually, you can go back again because this is a live link as well. And this particular transaction name group ends up in a service class of STC high and a report class of RSTC 088. That's probably not terribly useful compared to this, but maybe it is. You decide how you want to run your shop. So you got a service class here. Well, we can follow that into STC high here and what its actual definition is. Here's the migration, oh, sorry, the update dates. Here's the creation, and by the way, user ID migrate, I'm jolly sure is almost as meaningful as CJW. I think CJW, I think that's her initials. And the report class here, here's what the report class definition is, which might not add a huge amount of value, except for the description here might be the novel thing. So I'm just illustrating with these two examples how you can follow the links, and that might be useful for navigation. So how do you install it? Well, basically, it is a single PHP 7 or later script. Now, this wasn't true when I wrote these slides, the or later, because I was forced by reasons which I won't bother you with to go to PHP 8 very recently. You can probably guess why if you know about such things. So I've made a bunch of changes and actually pushed them to the repo for this. So PHP 7 or 8 script, you run it in a web server. Now, I personally use Apache web server. You don't have to. I use it on Mac OS, which actually explains why PHP 7 no longer was a useful thing. You need to enable the PHP plugin in the web server. And obviously, you need to be able to serve the HTML. Now, the way the code works is it's from the same directory that you put the raw XML in. And obviously you need appropriate permissions and security for your web clients somehow. So you probably want to run this on a PC or a Mac or whatever, maybe a Raspberry Pi. Hey, why not? Of some description. It doesn't need to be a powerful PC. The obvious question is, how do you get the XML to a web server? Well, I'll leave that to your imagination. I happen to be able to do it on my work Mac because I have built-in local host, and nothing stops me from getting the XML to the tooling. So you have to think about how you might get the XML to the tooling and serve it usefully. ... Okay. So the input data, well, it's static. It's not timestamped. So at this point, and I'm not pre-announcing anything, I'm not using RMF SMF at all. I'm simply using the XML. As I say, you can get the XML pretty readily out of your WLM Service Definition. You get it to the PC in the right directory. There's a question come up. Okay. So the question actually is, will SD2HTML work with the Apache web server provided with ZOS? I don't see why not, if you've got PHP. My assumption is the web server provided with ZOS, you can get PHP running on it. If somebody in the chat can confirm or deny that, that would probably be useful to us all. I don't know, is the honest answer. But the prereq here is going to be PHP running in whatever web server, and at 7 or later. And I wouldn't know if there is a PHP web for web server and ZOS, whether that's at 7 or not. We're not doing anything particularly funky with it. It's just I've only tested on 7 and now 8 and fixed on 8. Okay. Right. Oops. So, when you do the download, you want to make sure it's either ASCII or Unicode. In other words, you can read it on a PC in a text editor. But you're only going to do it once and get it right. When it comes out of ISPF, initially I had a problem with this XML because it was broken into 80-byte chunks. And actually I used BBEdit, which is a text editor on Mac, to reassemble it. But even then I was saying to customers, don't worry about it coming out in 80-byte chunks because I can repair it. Bigger issues are probably other character sets. Now, I've actually enhanced SD2HTML to reassemble those 80-byte chunks. So when you run this, if you do, you won't have to worry about it being broken into 80-byte chunks. Okay. Now, in practice, using it, you invoke the PHP script running on your web server from modern-ish web browser. I don't think we need to be saying modern, particularly because I think most web browsers are up to the level that supports the CSS and stuff like that. Personally, I use Firefox nightly because my judgment is dubious on Mac OS. I've never had Firefox nightly break for more than one night. I'm not suggesting you run on bleeding edge like that, but any reasonably modern browser would do. So the URL is going to look something like this. Here's localhost, which is what I'm doing, but you have to have your own server IP address and obviously the directory. So here's the script. And the first parameter, SDS equals whatever, that points at your local copy of the your local copy of the XML. Using whatever naming convention you use for subdirectories and all that, right? That's it. There are no other parameters. So once you've got this set up once, you probably will not need to play with it again. It's very straightforward. There might be some parameters we can invent. It's very easy to add query string parameters in PHP. So, there might be some formatting option we want, or hide something, or point at some different CSS or something like that. I don't know. We can easily add that stuff. The beauty of both sets of tunings, you can easily add stuff to it. Okay, so in conclusion, I'm going to address an issue here, which is, so I've made both these tools in my image, if you like, in the way I like to work, formatting things the way I like to format them. What if you like the idea in general of what either or maybe both of the tools, but you're not 100% happy with what it does? You think it could do more. By the way, I think that both of them could do more. You don't like the CSS, or you don't like the formatting of the CSV file that's output, or something else, right? Well, you can modify every single aspect of the code, and actually more to the point, particularly on the latter tool, the documentation. You can do it with a local copy. You can do it by forking the repo. The MIT license lets you do that. The GitHub mechanism lets you do that. Both of those, in fact. You could raise a GitHub issue. Very easy to do that, both for enhancement ideas and bug reports. You would be very welcome to contribute to either project. For example, the assembler database build code, you might decide it's particularly crappy assembler. I'm not going to defend it. It works nicely for me. I've already got upset with it and fixed it many times in terms of how good an assembler code it is. You might feel you can do better. That would be great. Better documented sample reporting jobs would be another one. You might contribute your own sample jobs. You might tweak the existing ones. You might add, for example, Python post-processing to the mix. And this is the thing, it's always difficult for a developer, documentation. You might feel you can contribute to the documentation. So there are lots of ways you could feedback if you were allowed to do so, which I think is the major inhibitor in this. At the moment, there's only one committer on either project, actually on several of my other open source projects too. I'm not the world's foremost GitHub expert by far. So, mentoring on that, I would certainly appreciate. I'm sure we all would. So look, if you're not 100% happy with either tool and you're unable to play, there are lots of things you can do which could be very constructive to either help yourself or help others in this, and certainly to help me. So the title of this presentation was two useful open source, or maybe I was hyperbolic and said two really useful open source tools. I think they are useful. They're certainly useful for me. I developed them for my own use and I use them a lot. In fact, nowadays, if you can't send me the XML, I'm not very happy of doing a WLM study. So I've used them in most of my customer engagements. What I've actually open sourced so far is almost all of what I use in IBM. SD2HTML is exactly what I use in IBM. There's nothing missing from that. The DDF tool, and I've alluded to a place where this is true, is about 80% complete. It's certainly complete in terms of the database build. I've missed nothing out there, but in terms of reporting I use, some of it is either fragile or needs more work before it can come over, or maybe it needs a rethink. So SD2HTML is designed to give you good reporting of your WLM service definition with many of the things that you won't get in SMF 72 subtype 3, such as classification rules, such as what resources are in the resource groups. Obviously, there are other tools around that can do similar things, but I don't believe there's another open source one. The DDF tool gives you good insight into performance. Really zoomed in is one of its party tricks, down to, let's say, the 1 second level, though you could go further in if you really felt the need to. I don't suggest you do, but the data model is entirely enabling of that. I've got 1 minute and 1 hour granularity reporting as examples already in the repo. And I've already got within the data this bit about the DDF clients. And which ones are using the CPU. I just don't have a convincing at the moment sample report on how you would show that. That's something I think I need to work on. And finally, I've said if you're allowed to more than enough times now, employer restrictions might prevent you from either using or more particularly participating in either of these projects. I would hope not. And the idea of the MIT license is really to make it as easy as possible for people to participate, whether as users or as contributors. So that's it, really. I seem to be just within time. I've enjoyed making these tools, I will say that, and I'm going to continue enhancing them regardless of whether anybody else uses them at all and regardless of whether anybody else contributes. If you'd like to contribute, very much welcome to do so. And as I say, there are lots of ways you can contribute to these projects. And don't be surprised if when I'm working with your data, you see the fruits of this tooling, either one. Okay, did anybody manage to come back on the question about PHP? And equally, are there any other questions or comments?
Just as a reminder, people can ask questions through the chat box, or also in person as well. If you prefer, just let me know and I can unmute you. And just give it a few moments if anyone wants to share any thoughts, comments.
Okay, thank you, Mike. So just to read out Mike's comment, I looked it up. PHP is provided as one of the free ported tools from Rocket. Now, my only hope is that the PHP that's ported, and this is going to sound snotty, and I don't mean it to be, I only hope that the PHP as ported is sufficiently up to date. I've not tested on anything below PHP 7. We might discover if it breaks on PHP 5 or something. Although I think PHP 5 is ancient history, so hopefully the port is reasonably up to date. So thanks for that, Mike.
I will pass that feedback on, Henry. If anyone's having problems with the feedback forms, sorry about that. I think they are trying to fix it. So yeah, so hopefully it should be fixed very soon. But if there are no other questions, I think we can. Yeah, it's not running on Z, unfortunately. If only. But yes, if there's no other questions, then we can give people 9 minutes back. Thank you very much, Martin, for the presentation and for your time as well.
You're very welcome. People know how to get hold of me, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone wants to refer back to this presentation, you can look at it on the website, and also a recording will be made available after the GSE presentation, so you can watch it back as well. And obviously, if you still have questions, you can contact Martin directly. Yeah, if the feedback form isn't working, then sorry about that. But please do donate to our nominated charities, which is the Guide Dogs for the Blind and RNLI as well. I've left the links in the chat box.
And I'll talk to some of you tomorrow when we're doing Scott Ballantyne and I are doing What's the Use, which hopefully you will enjoy, which will not be like this one was, the first running of the presentation.
Yeah, no, brilliant. Okay, thanks everyone for tuning in. Yeah, see you all shortly.